I'm talking with John Maddison, VP of Marketing for Fortinet. Welcome, John.
Good. It's always good to be here.
Yeah, John, Fortinet it's not quite fair to say it's the little engine that could. It's the big engine that could. Just continuous successes and reporting quarter to quarter, and yet seems underappreciated in the overall market because there's so much buzz going on. How do you attribute the whole market dynamic that's going on?
Yeah, well, I think that's changing a bit, Richard. I think you saw our results yesterday, very impressive results. Definitely taking market share from our competitors there. And I think we're starting to get recognized for that. And so some of the accounts we're winning in large enterprise and service provider and in the mid-market, we're starting to see some recognition in the marketplace for that.
I'm continuously amazed at the product breadth of Fortinet because, most companies, even by the time they go public, have, in some cases, a single product that might have gotten into a couple thousand enterprises. I can think of one, which we won't mention, that had a feature. They went to market with it. And yet, Fortinet continuously just has products for everything in the primarily network security, but we'll branch into endpoint as well. What's the philosophy behind that?
Well, it's all about building a platform. And so I think to stop threats, especially the more advanced threats, there's different infection vectors that then come inside, endpoint, the web, email, through networks. And so although our core product is FortiGate, which is our firewall, we actually kind of build out a platform to make sure we can cover those different infection vectors. And then make sure each of those elements can talk to each other. So for example, let's may have a phishing email coming through that we catch on our email security product. We can send that particular phishing email if it's suspicious to our sandboxing system, which can check it out. The sandboxing system could then maybe send some notification to our FortiGate firewall to stop a specific URL from going out. So it's all about making sure you can cover the complete boundary of a customer from an infection point of view. And so the platform is core and it builds out across that. And
there's a FortiMail. You could send a notification to that as well?
Right, so we have a FortiMail, we have a WAF product, FortiWeb. This week we also announced an upgrade to our FortiClient, which is also now part of what we call our ATP framework. So it too can send files to our core sandboxing product and get communication back. But the key is, it always comes back to the firewall. I think the firewall, obviously in our opinion, is the most strategic element of a security portfolio going forward. It sits there, it can see everything, it can stop everything. And so although we have products that sit in mail and web, application security and endpoint, it still all comes back in our mind to the core platform, which is the firewall or next-gen firewall.
And then over the years, Fortinet, if like most companies had made a make versus buy decision on components, and in particular research for malware and attack vectors, a lot of smaller vendors, when they go to market, decide to partner, with a provider, OEM provider of that information. But how big is Fortinet's research team now?
It's very expansive now, and we've always invested heavily in that. I think it is one of our key differentiators to some of our competitors. But I think it's very important when you're trying to trace the complete threat lifecycle that you have research in all the elements. So research in spam, research in malicious URLs, in malicious files, in IPS signatures. And so we have all that information that we can apply to our different products in our platform, but also allows us to then to go at a higher level and correlate across the whole life cycle to try and what we call stop the infection chain, kill the infection chain at some point during its life cycle.
And don't your customers get this tremendous benefit out of something that Congress is pushing for information sharing? And when I write and talk to people on the Hill, I try and stress to them, look at the large vendors are already providing that service. If anybody is a Fortinet customer, they get the advantage of the information sharing from all of Fortinet customers.
Yeah, and that's, I've talked about this a few times in the past, and I still think, even though there are some initiatives, and Fortinet founded, I think a couple of years ago now, the Cyber Threat Alliance with some of our competitors, which we continue to add members around. I still think the vendors can do a better job in sharing that information amongst themselves, and then sharing that information into government agencies. The more we can share the information, the more we can stop the threats.
Isn't there a big element just of operational architecture capabilities that comes from FortiGate in particular, because you've had to attach yourself so closely to the switch, the router? I mean, it truly is all in one.
Yeah, well, what we're finding with customers, there's a couple of big trends going on. One is they're wanting to have a single platform now across the whole network. And so, whereas maybe 5 years ago they would select a different vendor for the data center because they need maybe high speed there. Maybe they would select a different vendor for their edge because they need more security there. Maybe a slightly different vendor for their wide area network because maybe they needed integrated wireless inside the system. More recently, we're seeing interest in cloud systems as well. A lot of the customers we're talking to recently want to have a single platform across all of that. And so our architecture allows us to scale to hundreds of gigabits per second inside the data center. It also allows us to apply a lot more security at the edge in the next-gen firewall. We also have integrated versions with wireless for example, wide area or distributed networks. We also have cloud variants now, it's inside the cloud. And then also more recently, virtual machines and SDN capability. And so what the customer's looking to do is buy a single platform that fits across the whole network. And then the other trend we're seeing is that customers are realizing that they maybe have to rethink their architecture slightly. I think all those things I mentioned are at the border. And I think even though we're strengthening the border, there's still, as companies evolve their IT architecture, there's more ways in. So not all the endpoints have an agent on these days. They've got WAN connections to areas they're not quite sure about if they're secure. They've got clouds set up that are not quite secure. And so one of the trends we're seeing, and it's just starting recently, is that customers are looking to put firewalls inside their network. It's the internal network firewall, as we call it. It's not a new concept per se, but the ability to deploy a firewall in a transparent mode but providing protection against specific assets, maybe an intellectual property server or endpoints which haven't got protection, I think is going to be a big theme going forward. And so we're seeing, as I say, we're seeing a lot of customers rethink their architecture around not just the border, but inside that network.
Does it have to be an all Fortinet solution or nothing? Or are your customers still buying different point solutions for different things?
I think customers will always have different security solutions. I think within the mainstreams though, network security, firewall, endpoint, security management, application security, they're looking to have some more commonality inside those silos. And so, as I said, instead of having 2 or 3 firewall vendors across the whole network, they're looking for a single firewall vendor that has a platform that can expand and fit in all those different deployment modes, provide a single policy and a single reporting point.
So how come there are so many security vendors? I did a count the other day and I came up with over 1,400.
1,400?
Yes.
I'm not sure I counted that many. I think it's just a function of there's lots of, when the new threat comes up, there's a new bunch of security vendors come. Okay, and so I'm not sure if they ever go away. So they kind of stay there. I think what's happening, the market's growing at a certain rate, but I think market share is shifting. And so, for example, at the edge, where we consolidate both firewall, web filtering, and other functions inside their IPS, for example, we're seeing market share taken from some of the niche vendors. And so there'll always be a need for certain specific functions, but for the major platform deployments, you're seeing a consolidation happening.
What about the regional differences? There's been a lot of talk post-Snowden about various countries or regions trying to develop their own technology. We actually haven't seen much of that. We've seen some idea about new fiber, but how is Germany going to come up with an independent network or firewall security vendor?
Well, I think there's 2 sides to that. There's the government piece, and then there's also another subject we've talked about in the past is certification.
Yeah.
At Fortinet, we believe certification is very important, independent certification. And so we definitely subscribe to people like NSS Labs. We definitely work closely with test equipment like Ixia and Spirent. And we make sure that we put all our products through that test. It's a public test, it's not paid for. And so the results are determined by how good your product is. We did a recent test with NSS for something called Next Generation IPS. We still have certain customers who don't want to bring their firewall and their IPS together. And so next generation IPS has some newer security functionality inside there, such as app control. And so, they did the test. They test the price performance. They also test the effectiveness. And again, we did very well. But it takes a lot of effort to make sure our products do well, because they're public tests. The tests are designed to make sure the vendors are not inside there tweaking them. And again, we did very well in that test. And so our main focus right now is to make sure that our products are well certified across people like NSS Labs, ICSA, for example. I think for individual governments, we actually are meeting and working with them to see if they want to take some of our threat feeds, to see if there's other information they want around our products. And so it's almost on a individual country basis that we set up those meetings and offer to share our threat information with them.
Do you see any particular growth in any region that's changed over the last year?
It's pretty much universal. We've got something called our threat map, which actually is a graphical representation of threats which hit our systems. We've got 2 million appliances deployed right now on a global basis. And some customers allow us to kind of ping back to our core network once the hits happen. And you can see in this threat map, even though it's a snapshot in time, threats are pretty universal. A lot are coming maybe from China, but there's botnets sitting in the US. And if you speed it up, you'll see the graph just completely across on a global basis. Now, maybe the North Pole, I haven't seen too much activity there, but usually across the world it's pretty
There is some in Antarctica, I can
is that right?
that.
Oh,
yeah,
check that out. Good.
Yep, a lot of hacking down there. And how's Latin America, which is often lagged, I guess, as far as technology adoption?
Actually, that's doing extremely well. And I think a lot of the customers down there are trying to kind of leapfrog. Maybe they have traditional, maybe Cisco firewall sitting in there, and they're saying, hey, I need to go 2 or 3 steps. And so what we're seeing is actually some of our Latin American customers wanting to go to the absolutely latest technology, either at the edge or inside the data center or inside the cloud.
What do you think of this whole space of breach detection, security analytics, continuous network security monitoring, which is all that internal stuff you're talking about, but it's kind of a post foothold for the attacker?
I think there's definitely a place for that. I think it's important technology. It's hard, though, I think, just from the amount of data. From the threat landscape point of view, we see 600 million hits to our IPS systems, on a daily basis. And so you just think about that amount of data that's there. It's very hard to pick out a certain threat life cycle of an APT inside there. And then also inside customers' environments, they have a lot of data. They have a lot of syslogs from switches and routers and stuff. And so I think the key there is the ability to correlate and then represent in a visual manner. And so the ability to kind of pull all that data out, try and bring it to the highest level you can, show it visually, and then you can see the changes. I think until we get to that point, it's going to be very hard to kind of zoom in really quickly on a threat that's happening inside our network. And then the bigger kind of long-term goal, which I don't think anyone's got to yet, is correlating these life cycles really quickly across all that threat data, and making sure they can see the exploits or the attack service for specific customers. We're a bit of ways away from that, just because of the amount of processing power you're going to need to do that.
Yeah. And it seems like today the breach response vendors are tackling the 220-day lag problem. Should be pretty easy to cut that down to a week, but it's when it's the difference between 10 minutes and getting it down to a minute that it's going to be a real challenge.
Yes. There's that response time, as you say, it's response, so it means something's happened.
Right. Yeah.
That's the key and the key word inside there. And so if you can pick up some traits which are saying, well, this has changed slightly differently, then I think that's the key to then go in and zoom in and investigate that particular piece of your network or that data traffic in more detail.
So here's a market question for the security industry. Are we in a bubble?
I don't think so. I think if you look at spending on security, I think Gartner said it's risen from about 6% to 6.5% in the last year. And so that's of the total IT budget. So what we're saying is you're spending another, 85% of your budget on data centers, on switches and routers and storage and everything else. And so I still think there's some way to go, I think. And some of it's because I think infrastructure has been separated from security too long, I think. And we also announced last week some new data center switches which have integrated switching. So they have, one of them has 48 10 gig ports, which are perfect for a top-of-the-rack data center installation. So now instead of just putting a switch on your rack, they're putting an integrated switch and security device. And I think as infrastructure and security needs to come together, you'll start to see that spending increase. I think there's a long way to go yet before we reach the spending we need to make sure these networks are secure.
You bring up an interesting point. As a security guy, I always think that I'd rather start with security, for instance, to build a switch, or to build a router, or to build a phone PBX, than add security in later, as a patch on top of that. And yet you see the major switch communication vendors doing that. They're just slowly adding security as a patch or partnering with another box that sits on top of what they already have. When do they start to realize that Fortinet's kind of threatening them from the security side?
They're beginning to, and you're right. I think it's hard. That's why. I mean, if you want to run 100 gigabits per second firewall or switch, that takes some special technology to do that. You can't just stick an Intel chip in there and off you go. So first of all, it's hard, and so they need to redesign a lot of the systems, and that's what we've done from scratch with some of our systems to make sure you can run at those sort of speeds. But you're right. We'll also be talking about later on. We have a line of access points, for example, which again the wireless industry has been very much, hey, I need to provide AC so I get more speed and more speed, but I don't see the effort in there to make sure the security's better through authentication systems. And in fact, what we're doing going forward is starting to embed some of our security capabilities right inside the AP. And so I think gradually all the infrastructure vendors will realize that they have to start putting security as a higher list on their functions and making sure when they design or redesign or architect the systems, that security is right in there from the beginning.
Very good. What can you tell me about what we'll be talking about next year?
Next year? Well, that's a long way away. I will say we're at the show here with our FortiExpress, which is our I don't like to call it the truck, but it is a truck, which has all our products on site, our solution sets. It expands out, and we like to kind of show customers the kind of solution sets from a data center capability. I think next year we will be getting to a point where there's a bit more sharing information going on. I think there'll be more collaboration going on. And I think some systems which actually start to look deeper inside and predict what's going on within networks from a threat perspective.
Are you going to publish a schedule for the FortiExpress as it goes up?
It is published on our website. We actually have 2 FortiExpresses.
Oh,
Huge demand from our customers. It actually can be a training center, so it travels around. They both travel around the country to different shows, different events, providing training. I think one of the key points that we're seeing when I speak to customers is they really want more training on the new capabilities and security, and so it's actually a training center. They're actually both training centers as well, and so you can go on to Fortinet.com and see where the FortiExpresses are around the country.
Cool. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.